Hey guys, this is Pastor Jeff. Again, want to welcome you to Christ Church of the Valley and our weekend services. And again, back for an encore, I guess you could call it. Dr. Presley is with us, and he's going to take us into the next phase of the story. Last week, we looked at the life and times and troubles of King David. This week, we investigate a character that's quite interesting in the Old Testament, a man by the name of Solomon, a son of David. Solomon asked for something that many of us wish we had, and that is wisdom. But Dr. Presley, as he brings to life these narratives, he's going to bring to life Solomon and how Solomon's life relates to all of our lives. And I'm sure you're going to be different when you leave from the way you were when you came in. So again, give a great round of applause and a welcome to my theological professor through 3 years of seminary, Dr. Johnny Presley.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you once again. I've enjoyed these 2 weekends with you. Appreciate the welcome, the hospitality. And it's been a pleasure to work through the story. Last week, King David. This week, King Solomon, because they're great stories and lessons from which we can learn. Now, today, the title that we've been given is The King Who Had It All. If I were to ask you to think back to an occasion when you saw something and the thought that popped in your head is, well, I wish I had one of those. I think all of us have something like that we could think of, and maybe something big, maybe something expensive, maybe just something unusual, but you looked and said, I'd like to have one of those. Not yours, but I'd like to have one just like that. Now, whatever it is that you would think about that was that thing you wish you had, if we took yours and then everybody else in this room and put it together as one package, King Solomon probably had it. I mean, he had it all. That's the thing about Solomon. He's an amazing story, but he's also a story with some sad truths that need to be learned, and I want to show that to you today as we look at King Solomon. Let me describe him to you. The book of 1 Kings in the opening chapters tells his story. Let me describe him to you this way. First, he was a wise fool. A wise fool. Now, of course, he's famous for his wisdom. Let me talk about that, because he had a special gift of wisdom. Now, chapter 3 of 1 Kings tells the story of when he becomes the brand new king. Young guy, just getting started. He prays to God. He says, God, I pray that you'll give me wisdom and discernment, the ability to see right and wrong, to make good decisions and stay away from bad decisions. I pray you'll help me to be a good king, because David has set the bar high, and I want to do right by my father, by the people, and by you. And God was so pleased with that prayer. He said, oh, that's a great prayer. It's a humble prayer. And God said, I will bless you with wisdom. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 through 31, it describes the wisdom of Solomon. Verse 29 says, he was given great wisdom, great discernment. Oh, you've seen these TV shows or read the novels. Some detective, he could walk in on a scene, he looks and he figures out a whole bunch of stuff nobody else can see. Solomon was like that. It wasn't fiction with him. He could size up people, size up things, and just see things that the rest of us would miss. Great wisdom, great discernment. And it says his knowledge. He had a mind that would study things and learn things and remember things. It says his knowledge was so vast, so broad, that you couldn't measure it. It'd be like trying to count the sands on a seashore. We'd say an encyclopedia mind, a computer brain, but he had it. It also says in the next verse, verse 30, it says that he was so wise that he was wiser than any of the great wise men from the East. For example, Arabia, that was famous for a lot of scholastic writings, but he was wiser than that. Or Persia, where the wise men were, like in the Christmas story, or even Far East, even India, Asia, didn't matter. He had a mind that was beyond theirs. And it says, and in Egypt, and that would be to the west, that was the center of education to the west. Egypt was the great universities, and Solomon still had them all beat. Now, I don't know if Solomon is the greatest ever. I don't know how to compare him afterwards, because we've seen some pretty impressive people as far as the genius level they reach. But, that's still a small, exclusive club to be in that, and Solomon definitely belongs there at some level, because as far as what the people of his day knew and had ever seen, Solomon was as great as it got, full of wisdom and knowledge. Now, give you an idea of just how much knowledge there was with Solomon. He's a prolific writer. He wrote 3 books of our Old Testament, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. We're told in 1 Kings that he wrote about 3,000 Proverbs. They're in the book of Proverbs, or many of them are. It says he wrote about 1,005 songs. Now, Song of Solomon is just one song, a very long one. However long the others are, there's 1,004 out there somewhere. He's a great writer. He also was a great student, just studied things, all types of disciplines. A science man, for example. The text tells us he was into botany, plant life, and also into zoology, the different animals, and biology, how the inner workings of living things operate. He's just a man that had to know things and then would learn it. Impressive. Now, the text tells stories about him. One of the first stories told about Solomon to show off his wisdom is there at the beginning when he was first starting. God had just given him this gift. And he's sitting on the judgment seat, because that's what kings did. They decided important cases. And two women come in. One's holding a baby. The other doesn't have one. The woman without the baby says, she stole my baby. Said, we both had babies. They're prostitutes, the story says. They live in a house together, probably with some other women. But both have become pregnant, both given birth to sons. And it had been very recent. But this woman says, now her baby died during the night, and she swapped the babies, took mine when I was asleep. And I woke up, I found this dead baby, but I can tell that's not mine. And I can look and see that one's mine, and I want it back. Now, the other woman says, no, this is my baby. She lost hers, and in her grief, she's trying to take mine, and that wouldn't be fair to take mine away from me just because she says so. And here Solomon got to decide. So the baby's before him. He says, bring me a sword. He takes that sword. He lines it up right down the middle. They say, what are you doing? I say, I'm going to cut this baby in half. Each of you gets half. That sounds fair to me. You can't do that. Yes, I can. I'm the king. And he gets that sword lined up, ready to go. And as he's ready to slice that baby, one of the women shouts out, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't hurt that child. I'd rather you give the baby to her than to hurt the child. And Solomon says, no, that's the mother. Do anything to protect the child. And that one's a liar and a thief and ought to be punished for what she did. And everybody stood around and said, wow, why didn't I think of that? Well, Solomon had a special gift of wisdom. And that story took off and spread, and a whole bunch of other stories just like it. And so he had a reputation around the world. In fact, we're told in 1 Kings that important people, dignitaries, powerful people, they traveled to Jerusalem. They just wanted a chance to meet this guy. They'd bring him gifts, and then they'd sit down and talk to him, sit down and watch him, because he was a celebrity in his day. In 1 Kings chapter 10, it tells the story of the Queen of Sheba. She shows up with her entourage, and she just wants to watch him and ask him questions. Now, when she finishes, she makes a statement that's become somewhat famous. She says, when I was back in my home country, I didn't believe everything I heard about you, but now that I've met you, the half has not been told. In other words, I'm not sure half of what I heard before I thought was real, but I tell you, now that I've met you, I realize they didn't even tell me half of all the greatness of your wisdom. He's an impressive man, apparently. A man of great wisdom, a special gift of wisdom. But he wasted it on foolish things. So that's the sad part of Solomon. Special gift of wisdom, but wasted it on foolish things. Now, let me tell you, in the story of Solomon, the first indicator that the guy doesn't have it all together is he married 700 wives and had 300 female concubines. Now, there's a few of you fellas out there, you're grinning, and you're thinking, man, that would be cool, have all those women. If you're sitting next to one of those guys, slap him on the back of the head, because that's a stupid idea. Trying to manage that many women and keep them all happy and do them all right, you're just asking for trouble. Some of you in this room, you're old enough, you may remember the Oak Ridge Boys Quartet and the song they sang, trying to love two women is like a ball and chain, sometimes the pleasure just ain't worth the pain. Well, I tell you, it works that way if you're trying to juggle all of that. Now, it may be that some of you are thinking, yeah, but you know, back in those days, that's what they did. They were used to it. I mean, they had the patriarchs, they had their many wives. Yeah, they did. And they had their various reasons why they did it. Sometimes it's alliances, political treaties between clans or between nations. And sometimes it would be just economic. Have a whole bunch of kids so they can get out there and work and increase the family wealth. And sometimes it just simply be desire. I like the looks of you and the looks of you. But whatever the reasons, read the stories from Genesis on carefully and you'll see the troubles. Oh, those relationships had so many troubles. Between that one man and all these wives he had to try to manage. Between the women themselves as they vied for his affections, and then between the children, all these half-children that struggled in their place in the family. You see, the situation didn't always turn out as nice as it might seem. Fact is, if you had just paid attention to the beginning when God the Creator was setting things up, you can often find what's the best thing to do if you just watch God. Here's Adam. He says, it's not good for a man to be alone. I'm going to create a helper suited for him. And he didn't create a harem. He created Eve and put those two together. And sometimes we think we're smarter than God, but if we just go back and let God show us things, we're often a lot smarter then. So let me give you just my own personal word of advice. I mean, I'm coming up on my 40th wedding anniversary, and it takes a lot of work to hang in there and make this thing work. I would just say, guys, find you one good woman, and ladies, find you one good man, and why don't you make that thing work and quit looking around at something else, right? Make that thing work and work well, because it takes a lot of effort just to do that and have it pay off well. Well, poor old Solomon, you can already tell from the beginning, he may be the wisest man, but there are some things he's doing that just aren't adding up, and he himself says so. I call him a wise fool. You may say, well, that's kind of harsh, isn't it? He calls himself that. He tells the story. Book of Ecclesiastes, he tells the story. Because in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs both, he'll set you up with a wise man and a foolish man, wisdom and foolhardiness. And he says, the world knows me as the wise man, but I have to tell you, there's a lot of days I'm the fool, and he'll show it to you. For example, in the book of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 2, verses 9, 10, 11, he describes himself. In verse 9, he says, I was the greatest Jerusalem had ever seen. And he mentions specifically his wisdom. But then in verse 10 he says, but even with all that wisdom, if my eye saw it, if my heart wanted it, I went after it. And in verse 11 he says, and when I got done and looked at it all, I realized a lot of it was meaningless. It was a waste. You see, Solomon was a guy that he had all the smarts, but he didn't make all the best decisions. Now, how can a guy with that much advantage go astray? What was his problem? Well, he'll tell you where he went wrong. For example, in chapter 1 of the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, I got this gift from God, this wisdom, and this capacity for knowledge, for knowing things, this inquisitive curiosity. He said, I decided I'm going to go out there and try everything. And he said, I didn't care what it was. I was going to try it. He says, I decided I'm going to try everything that's wise and smart, but he also said, I also decided I was going to pursue madness and folly. That is, things that people say, you got to be crazy to do that. So I'm going to say, I'm going to try that. He had to do everything, he said, just because I wanted to know. Now, if you've got this electrical outlet, and about 6 people ahead of you wet their finger and stick it in there, and they get shocked and they fall down. But by the time you see about 6 people do it, now there's a few of you in this room. You'd go ahead and do it anyway just to see. But most of us would say, I don't need to do that. I think I got that one figured out. We can very smartly figure out what happens when you do that. It's kind of like getting your hand burned. I don't have to stick my hand in a fire so I can know what it feels like to be burned. I just listen to you scream and describe it to me, and I'm good. That's all I need. Because you don't have to do everything to understand things. And Solomon thought, well, I got to try it all. It's kind of like when a parent's dealing with a dense kid, and you're chewing him out for whatever it is he or she did, and you're not getting much response there. And you say, look, if all of your friends jump off a cliff, you going to do it? Well, I don't know. I'm thinking that is not a kid that is wise yet. You see, the wisdom says I can learn from experience and things. I can learn from observing. I can learn from being taught. I don't have to actually do it all. And what Solomon said, no, I do. I gotta try it all. I got to touch everything. That was a mistake. He says in chapter 2, in that verse 10, he says, if my eye saw it, if my heart wanted it, he said, I wouldn't tell myself no. No restraints, no self-discipline, just go for it, he said. Now, he writes the book of Ecclesiastes at the end of his life. It starts off in chapter 1, verse 1 with that famous opening, vanity, vanity, all of life is vanity. And we try to figure out how do we convey that to modern ears so it makes sense. Sometimes a translator will say foolishness, foolishness, it's all foolishness. Tell you what I like, wasted. It was all a waste. My life was a waste. My years, my energy, my resources, my health, I wasted it all. That really captures the book of Ecclesiastes. An old man looking back saying, what a waste in the way I lived my life. And then you read the book and he'll tell you the ways he wasted his life. Smart guy, made some foolish decisions. In fact, he'll talk about it even in his other books like Proverbs. He'll talk about how he would do what he felt like even though he knew better. His wisdom said don't, but his heart said do. He says, for example, in the book of Proverbs, there are ways that will seem right to a person, but they'll end up at a dead-end street, and he did that so often. So you and I need to learn a lesson from Solomon, and we certainly can. For example, I'll tell you this. Just because you got a lot of education, book smart, doesn't mean you're smart. You can make some stupid mistakes. Now, I know from experience in that I live in that community. I'm part of the academic community. I'm a professor, graduate professor, and so I'm surrounded by colleagues, both at my school, but also friends of mine at other schools, got their PhDs, all that good education, and some of them are so stupid. When it comes to life decisions, and they'll make stupid decisions about their finances or about some pleasures or about their marriage or what's outside of their marriage. And sometimes when I'm talking to a real good friend, one I can just open up with, I'll just tell him, I think the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes is written all about you. Because you are definitely a wise fool. That is, you got a lot of knowledge, but you are making stupid mistakes that you should know better. Yeah, I know. But see, just because you got knowledge doesn't necessarily mean you've got wisdom. Now, I'm in the business of training students with a whole bunch of knowledge, but I also tell them, but pick up wisdom along the way. You need that. How to make good decisions, how to see right. And you got to have the wisdom and not just the knowledge. I'll tell you something else, though. You can have wisdom, but it's not just knowing what's right, it's doing what's right. Solomon had a lot of wisdom, he just didn't do it. And so it's more than just having wisdom, it's actually following wisdom and doing what it says, and that's where he failed. In fact, really, if you want to catch what's wrong with Solomon, he himself will tell you, it's like this. Here's what God says, and here's what everybody else is saying, because he studied everybody, read everything. Here's what God says, but here's what I think might be right, or here's what God says, and here's what I feel like doing. And while Solomon's life a lot of times was spent by doing what other people said or what he felt like or what he thought, he says at the end of his story, he says, no, but what I should have done is gone back to basics. Here's what God says. And wisdom listens to God when he speaks his word and then does what God says. That's how it works. That's why if I were to give you a word to the wise, as I look at this wise fool, I'd give you Solomon's own words, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and then he'll make your path straight. And if Solomon had listened to his own advice, his life would have turned out so much better. Put everything in the Lord, in his word, do what he says, and don't be listening to yourself because that'll take you astray. But if you follow him, he'll make your paths straight. Now, not only was Solomon a wise fool, he was also a wealthy glutton. A wealthy glutton. Let me first talk about the wealth of Solomon. Solomon had everything money could buy. That's how the scriptures describe him. Chapter 10 of 1 Kings describes the wealth of Solomon. Here's the way it puts it in verse 23. He had more wisdom and more wealth than any king in all the earth. And then chapter 10 will describe the wealth of Solomon. Now, I'll tell you where he got it from. He got it because of that prayer back in chapter 3 of 1 Kings. He asked God, give me wisdom. I need to rule this kingdom and do well by the kingdom and by you. God said, you could have asked me for wealth and power and things like that. You didn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you wisdom, but I'm also going to give you those other things just as a bonus. So God blessed him with great wealth. First, his kingdom grew, and the treasury was enriched, and the people benefited from this great, wealthy kingdom. But Solomon also made sure he got his cut. And he kept piling up his own personal assets as his personal wealth built up. And in doing so, Solomon became quite extravagant in the accumulation of wealth. 1 Kings 10 describes some of the things Solomon did for himself. For example, it says he had many homes, mansions. He had a lot of gardens, a lot of estates. And at some point when you see the description of Solomon, all these buildings and such he's doing just for himself, you think, how many houses does one guy need to live in? It's kind of like the way you and I will sometimes look at a person who's got a whole bunch of money and he's just spending a whole bunch and buying a whole bunch of things. You're thinking, really? Did you need all of that? And even the person says, well, I got the money, I can afford it. Yeah, but still, is that the smartest thing to do with all your money? So Solomon was like that. He was extravagant. He accumulated things for himself. Also with Solomon, only the best. Couldn't take anything second. It had to be the best. It says in the 1 Kings 10 that in his dinnerware, everything had to be gold. Plates, utensils, goblets. He wouldn't take silver. Now, silver was valuable, but a lesser value, no seconds for Solomon. It has to be number one. If he lived today, he could only shop at the best store. He couldn't shop at some of the stores you and I like to shop at sometimes, get a good deal. Not Solomon. And when it came to buying an item, it couldn't be a good item. It had to be the very best. Which one is it? Even if it's most expensive, Solomon had to have the best of everything. That was his extravagance. He also says in 1 Kings 10, he used to send his ships out exploring the world, bringing back treasures. He just wanted stuff around his house. And I laugh sometimes when I read the list of things that Solomon would have imported. For example, one of the verses says, ivory and apes and peacocks. I'm thinking, really? Seriously? You need monkeys and peacocks roaming around your backyard just to feel good. And sounds a lot like some of these millionaires you and I know got more money than good sense, and they did all this tacky stuff all around their house. Solomon was like that. You see, Solomon's a guy that had to have things, and he was accumulating all this wealth, which really displays a character weakness in Solomon, and the character weakness is this. He may have had everything money can buy, but he never had enough to satisfy, just not quite enough to satisfy. In fact, he tells you that. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10, Solomon says, speaking from his own experience, once you start to love money, you can never have enough. Once you love wealth, you'll never be satisfied, and that was his story, never could get enough. So, for example, when it came to wealth, no matter how much he had, he always wanted more. In fact, for Solomon, it became almost like a game in which I got to have everything. And so, for example, having a pet. Well, most of us, a good dog, maybe a good cat, or both, that's pretty good. Not Solomon. I wonder what all kinds of pets are there that you could possibly have. In addition to a dog and cat, I'd like to have a pony and a peacock and a poodle and a pygmy pig and whatever else. If it's out there, I want it. He'd have them all. And it may be that not just simply having a good dog, oh, Blue, he's loyal, he's true, he stays with me. No, you got that funny dog with that fluffy tail. I'd like to have one of those. And that big dog you got, I'd like to have one of those. He'd have to have one of everything. Even that wouldn't satisfy him. You got one, I probably need two. If you got two, I need four. I mean, Solomon was just all about, like it's a game, just accumulating the stuff. Now, it's interesting, though, you read his writings, book of Proverbs, book of Ecclesiastes, he cautions me and you against greed. Be careful with greed, because greed gets in your heart, and you'll never be satisfied. You always want more. And while you and I sometimes think it's just poor people that are greedy, they're always wanting stuff. No, Solomon tells you, hey, listen, there's a lot of greed among the poor, I'm sure, but among the wealthy, there's a lot of greed. They just never quite satisfied in their hearts. They want more. I mean, he said the right words. He was a wise man, but he didn't practice his own words. He was always desiring more. Now, not just wealth, but more when it came to the women. Did I mention those 700 wives and 300 female concubines? Yeah, the man never quite found a level where he was quite satisfied that I've got plenty. And he will write in the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes, warning me and you. Be careful about lustful desires of the heart, because they'll lead you astray and get you in trouble. You need to learn how to be satisfied with what you've got. He could talk about it, but he didn't practice it. He could always see one more and one more and one more. I tell people, don't necessarily look at the practice of Solomon when it comes to women, but look at the words of Solomon, because he did write some great words. And for example, Proverbs chapter 5, verse 15, he tells all you fellas, he says, now you need to be satisfied with the cistern that you have. That's a well with water. In other words, dip your bucket in your well of water and you're drinking that, but you see your neighbor, he's got a well, and wonder what the water tastes like in his well. Solomon says, mind your own business. Just be satisfied with the well and the water in your well. That's his PG-rated nice way of talking about sex, but basically, you got your wife, enjoy that, and quit looking around at all these other women that are out there. Enjoy what you've got. That's good advice. Or 3 verses later, chapter 5, verse 18 of Proverbs, he'll say, now you need to find joy in the wife of your youth. Oh, that's an all too familiar sad story. A young couple, madly in love, man, this is great. We get older, though, you're not as attractive as you used to be. You're not as hot as you used to be, but she is. And I'm thinking of leaving you and going to her, and Solomon cautions, no. You two had something. You found something in each other. You committed, you love each other. Now, as you get older, find satisfaction in the wife of your youth and quit looking around at others. You see, he could say the right words. He just didn't always do his own advice. A wise man, but made foolish decisions. A wealthy man with plenty, but he never had enough. He was always wanting more. More wealth, more women, and also more wine and food. He tells you that story as well. He said, I got out there. He said, I decided everything that's out there that can be eaten, I got to eat it. I got to try it. And anything you can drink, I got to drink it. And Solomon, it wasn't just enough to try it. I got to take it to extremes. He had to push everything to excess. He'll tell you, he says, I'd eat it until I get sick. I'd drink until I get drunk. I just had to try it all and try everything. Now, I'm not here to tell you what to eat and not eat, or what to drink and not drink. I'd rather put the emphasis where Solomon himself puts it in his writings, as he learned the lessons the hard way. And that is this. He would say, really, you need to learn how to not go to excess, go to extreme, overindulgence. And the Scriptures time and time again tell us about that. Stay away from drunkenness. Stay away from gluttony. Stay away from just going too far. And in fact, really what the Bible typically will teach about the pleasures of this world, it'll teach us the principle of moderation, learn how to do a reasonable portion and then call it quits, or even abstinence sometimes where you just simply say, no, I'm not doing that at all. And in my life, I've tried to practice those two principles. There are some things I'll do. It's a lot of fun. I'm not sure how healthy it is. I'm going to do a little bit of it, but I'm going to stop because moderation is a key. Sometimes I'll just tell myself, I don't need that at all. I'm just not doing that. And most of us in this room, we've learned how to try to use those two principles and practice some moderation or even just practice abstinence where it needs to be. But what we really want to do is learn the hard lessons of Solomon. Don't go to that overindulgence. Don't get carried away, because when you do, you're being foolish. And Solomon, the wise man, knew what foolish was like. You see, Solomon is a guy who just couldn't get enough. Whether it be wealth or women or wine and food or pleasures of this world, he always had to have more. And always had to have more than what he really needed. If I were to give you a word to the wise, though, from Solomon, borrowing his own words, I'd give you Proverbs 15, verse 16. Here's what he says: better is a little with the fear of the Lord than to have great wealth and a whole bunch of trouble. Most of us in this room, we're in that first category. We're not wealthy people. We don't have this huge stuff. We got our little. Learn how to be satisfied and content and thank the Lord for the blessings He has given you, because better to have a little with the fear of the Lord than to have all that stuff and then the troubles that often comes with it. If Solomon had listened to his own advice, what a better life he'd have had. Well, he was a wise fool. He's a wealthy glutton. He's also a holy sinner. A holy sinner. Now, when I wrote this outline, I looked at it and thought, that's kind of strange. That's weird. It is, but that's Solomon. See, Solomon, first, he was holy, and that is, he was set on the right course. Now, here's the idea. The word holy, as used in the Old Testament, refers to something that God has set apart for a very special mission, a very special task, a special purpose. So, for example, they're out in the wilderness. Here's a city of tents, but God picks one tent and sets it apart to be a place of worship, calls it the tabernacle, says that's a holy place. Here's all these men in Israel, but He picks one man, sets him apart to be the high priest and lead their worship, and says that's a holy man. See, the word holy means God has set you apart for something very special. Now, that term definitely fits Solomon, because Solomon was set apart by God for a very special mission, to be king of Israel and lead them to great things. He was set on the right course by God Himself. Now, you'll see the story, for example, in 1 Kings, first in chapter 3, then later in chapter 9. That is, twice, God will appear to Solomon in a vision and then tell him what to do and tell him what to stay away from. Just lay it out for him, set his course right. I like, for example, what He does in chapter 9, the second time He appears, verse 4 and 5. He says to Solomon, He says, now, if you will walk before me faithfully, if your heart will be filled with integrity, if it'll be upright like your father David, I'll bless you and make you a great kingdom. See, He'll lay out the law for Solomon. This is what you need to do. And I want you to know what Solomon got from God in those two visions was very special. Most people never got something like that. You and I usually don't get something quite like that. You said sometimes we like to think, boy, if I lived back in the Old Testament days, that would have been great. God talking to you all the time, visions all the time. No. Take all the stories in the Bible where God actually spoke to someone with words or showed them a vision, and you add all those up, get your number, and then take all the years of Bible history, the centuries, the millennia of ages. What you'll find is statistically, words and revelations and visions from God were rare. Fact is, most of the kings will never have God actually speak to them in any direct way. Solomon twice had God appear to him and talk to him and tell him what to do. I mean, he had advantages nobody else got as God set him on the right course. And it wasn't just God who set him off. It was his father David. 1 Kings chapter 2, David sat him down right before he dies, and David says, I got a few last words for you. And I like what he says in the opening. He says, Solomon, I want you to be the man and do whatever God tells you to do. See, today we would say, Solomon, I want you to man up and do what's right. Well, David said that. He said, I want you to be the man and you do what God tells you to do. Well, Solomon was set on the right course. Should have turned out great, but the problem is he was easily led astray. Oh, he may have been set right, but he was easily led astray. And 1 Kings chapter 11, as you draw to the end of the Solomon story, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4 tells you what happened. It said his wives, those wives. Did I mention those 700 wives and the 300 female concubines? It says the wives, they led his heart to other gods. I'll tell you what happened. He married those foreign wives with their foreign faith. Now, it wasn't about the race, it was about the faith. That's the way it always was with the law of Moses. I'm not sure all the Jews understood that. Some of the Jews thought it was about keeping their race pure. I'm not sure every Christian has understood the Old Testament well on this matter, but you read Moses. Read it carefully. Read why he tells them, be careful about who you form an alliance with and who you marry, because he'll talk about them leading you astray to their faith versus the faith you have in the true God. And that was the problem of that kind of thing. Now, on the other hand, we've got some good people in the Old Testament. They came from some other religion and other faith, but once they became to Jehovah God, they become some of our heroes. I got Ruth. We got a book of the Old Testament written about Ruth, the Moabite. But she committed herself to Jehovah God. She becomes one of our heroes. Or I got Uriah the Hittite. We talked about him last week, the husband of Bathsheba. He's a Hittite coming from some other place, some other faith, but he commits himself to Jehovah God, and he's fighting in the Lord's army. You see, it was always about their faith. And if someone were to think, well, I'll just, after I marry them, I'll convert them, God would say, yeah, there's that other possibility. They convert you. You see, God always was very clear on this matter through the law of Moses. And Moses said to the general population that rule, but he told the kings and the leaders, and you especially be careful on this matter. 1 Kings 11 says Solomon ignored the rules altogether. He first married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, formed an alliance with Egypt. Then it says every nation around him, he married the daughters and he started forming these alliances. And he ignored the warning of God that they might turn you to other gods. And sure enough, verse 4 says they did. They turned his heart to other gods. I know how it happened. You're going to take this young girl away from her family, her home, and forever now she's going to live over here somewhere else. The request will be, but can I take some things with me, some family, some friends? Can I take some things? And of course you say, sure, bring whatever you want. And as she's bringing things, she'll also bring some idols, some icons, maybe some priests. At some point the request will come, you got this big temple to Jehovah God. Can I build this little altar? Can you respect my faith? And Solomon will. He'll say, sure, sure, sure. And the text says he let his wife start to build altars and temples. And I look at some of the names of some of those gods that he allowed to build temples right there at Jerusalem, and some of them are pretty bad. They're into child sacrifice, things like that. How can a king of Israel compromise that badly? David would have never done it. See, that's the difference between David and Solomon. In fact, I knew Solomon was in trouble when I saw his story begin back at the very beginning of 1 Kings. Because once he becomes the king and he's been filled with wisdom, here's what it says. And so he set out to serve God because he loved the Lord, except, and then becomes the first exception to the rules that he makes. And after that, it'll be a whole bunch more. See, he wasn't quite like his father. His father, David, was a man after God's own heart. David's heart, God's heart, just alike. Because while David wasn't perfect, and I showed you that last week, David knew when he was wrong, and he knew he wanted to do what was right. And he always came back to God and did what he could for God, because his heart was set on God. But see, 1 Kings 11 says at the end of the Solomon story, well, he says, Solomon, it says, he did great evil in the eyes of the Lord, because he was not fully devoted to the Lord like his father David. His heart wasn't like David's heart. That was a weakness with Solomon. He fell astray, and so easily. If I were to give you a word to the wise, it'd be what Solomon himself says. Into the book of Ecclesiastes, that book he wrote at the end of his life, when he looks back and says, I wasted it all. Final chapter, chapter 12, final verse, verse 13, here's what Solomon says. He says, you've heard my story. Let me give you the conclusion. I'll give it to you in one sentence. Fear God and obey his commands. That's the whole duty of man. I mean, think about that. Can you get serving God down to just one sentence? Fear God and do whatever he tells you to do. So here's Solomon. Here's what God says, but here's what I want. Here's what I think. Here's what others say. No. Fear God and obey his commands. That's the whole duty of man. You know, that's the difference between wise and foolish. And in this room, my challenge for you is this, that you be wise, that we set aside those foolish things we sometimes do, stop being stupid, as so often we are, and commit ourselves to following the course that God puts in front of us. His word says it, let's just do it. Whether I agree, disagree, like it, don't like it, doesn't matter. What God says, let's do. Because when you do that, you're practicing wisdom. Wisdom always begins with the Word of God and doing what God's Word says. And those of us who live like that can become wise people in the eyes of God. Hey, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this challenge from Solomon. We need it. We need this reminder. Help us now to be a people committed to you and to your Word. And regardless of what we personally think or feel or what we hear and what others say, help us, Father, to commit to you, to your Word, to your way, and to follow that because, Father, that's where wisdom lies. And we want to be a people who live by the wisdom of your Word in all that we do. We thank you, Father, for all your blessings. We thank you for Jesus Christ. We pray in his name. Amen.